Over the past couple of years, the idea that we have emotional connections to the landscapes that we roam has really fascinated me. After an incredible 2 years based in New Zealand, spent effectively learning my trade as a landscape photographer, I really think that deep down I actually couldn't wait to return to the UK. My realization now is that I actually have some sort of genuine and intrinsic attachment to Britain's landscapes, and I strongly believe that this funnels into my landscape photography. I don't think it's an awfully comprehensible topic. I think it's quite a difficult one to understand, but it's something that I know exists because I physically felt it whilst out with my camera in certain places. So first and foremost, guys, welcome back to the channel. Thank you ever so much for tuning in as always, and yeah, welcome back to my second discussion of the week, and something that I'm really enjoying doing. Now I'm going to get straight into it this week because I mentioned in my Tuesday video that I've got some news, and you perhaps have guessed already, but I'm going to be moving back to the UK within the next couple of weeks from here in Germany. And before I get into the sort of topics surrounding this week's video, the move back hasn't necessarily really got anything to do with photography. I'm not moving back for, anything to do with this YouTube channel or my photography. It's more a sort of life decision that me and my girlfriend have made together. Things are okay here, but where we're living in Munich in particular is quite expensive, and we don't necessarily feel like we're getting a lot of return back from Munich or back from Germany for the amount of money that we're putting out there. We feel like kind of anything that we can sort of have here in Germany and Munich, we can kind of have at home, and it's a lot cheaper. But yeah, like I say, it's not really got anything to do with the photography. But with regards to this week's topic, it turns out I'm actually really grateful for this little stint, we'll call it, that me and my girlfriend have had here in Germany, because it's given me a lot of realization. I've actually learned a lot about myself, actually. And this week I kind of want to talk a little bit about our emotional attachments to landscapes as landscape photographers. And I think it's something that I've touched upon a little bit on the past, but it's something I've always been quite fascinated about. And I think it's quite difficult to explain. It's quite difficult even for me to understand myself about what's going on, but I know that it definitely exists, because I've been out there in the landscape and I can feel the emotions, like real strong emotions of like a connection or an attachment that I definitely have to certain landscapes. And for me, that is Britain. Some areas in Britain more than others, but the whole island of Britain, let's say, is something that I really do have an emotional attachment to, photography aside. And I think the past couple of years, it's been a real slow process of me kind of realizing this, and how much this emotional attachment actually means to me and my photography. I think a really, really big part of why I enjoy landscape photography is being out in these specific landscapes and environments that are really dear to me, I suppose, and on the basis of it. And I think for me, it's not necessarily about photographing something that looks pretty, photographing a landscape that just looks attractive. To me, I think it's more than that, but it's something that I've not really realized up until kind of now. And that's what I mean by how I'm really grateful for this trip, because I think it's a lot deeper to me. Now, I think there's different types of emotional attachments. It doesn't always have to be this sort of intrinsic attachment that I keep going on about, like I have with Britain. I think sometimes you can just be amongst a landscape that is just awe-inspiring, and then that can also, funnel into your landscape photography, so to speak. So I kind of wanted to touch upon these different types of emotional attachments in this week's video as a topic, really, because I just think it's fascinating. It's so interesting. And, before I get into it, I'd love to know, on the basis of it, if you guys have ever felt this sort of emotional attachment to a certain landscape. I don't actually think it necessarily has to be where you come from. I think for me, it's just a coincidence. I come from Britain, and that's the place that I have these attachments to. But I don't think it necessarily has to work like that. So I'd really love to hear from you guys. Do you have these emotional attachments to anywhere yourselves with regards to your photography? So, because I was so interested in this topic as a whole, I did a little bit of research online about it, just to see if anyone else has experienced it or spoken about it. And I couldn't actually find that much, to be honest, especially, directly related to landscape photography. But I found this theory anyway, the theory is called place attachment, and this is pretty much what I mean. It's nothing to do with photography, what I was reading about, but it's everything to do with what I'm talking about in today's video. And I've got down here a couple of definitions, and these are literally just definitions of what place attachment means. And I really wanted to read them out to you guys just to try and simplify everything, because I think it can be a little bit complex. So the first definition, nice and simple. Place attachment, so the extent to which an individual values and identifies with a particular environmental setting. So I really like that. It's a kind of explanation of the relationship between the person and the landscape or the environment that they're in, and how it affects them. What are they getting from the landscape or from the environment? So I think that's really relatable to us as landscape photographers, because a lot of time when we're out on location, we have an attachment to the landscape. And like I mentioned briefly at the start, it's something that I'm only really just starting to realize exists, and I really like it. It's good, and it's definitely good for my photography. Now there's a second definition. It's quite similar, but again very simple. A positive emotional bond between individuals and their environment. And I really wanted to mention that one because it is a positive emotional bond. What happened in Scotland, I think I was at the Three Sisters, and I pulled up at the car park off, is it the A38, the main road that goes through the Highlands anyway, and I saw the Three Sisters in front of me, and I actually started crying. I didn't capture it in the vlog on video, thank God, but yeah, I was just sat in my car, I turned the ignition off, and something just sort of hit me like a brick wall, and I started crying my eyes out, and it was positive feelings, tears of joy almost, I suppose you'd call it. And then I spent the day just like, it was one of my best photo shoots, but I know that it was because of that emotional attachment, that I have to Scotland, or perhaps it was only that specific area, but I have felt it in other places in Scotland. So again, like, is it something you guys have ever experienced? I'd really love to hear about that. And I think for me, I mentioned Scotland. Scotland and the Lake District, very, very specifically. I feel emotional attachments to other places in Britain and other places in the world, but it's never as strong as the lakes or Scotland. And for me, it's quite simple as to why in many ways. The Lake District, I'm from there. I was born there, I grew up there. Got wonderful childhood memories, and every time that I go back there, I feel these emotions. So in many ways, I suppose you could say it could be nostalgia. But either way, whatever it is, it makes me enjoy my photography tenfold when I'm there because of that emotional attachment and connection. And then secondly, like I said, Scotland. I mentioned in that specific Scotland video that my dad's from Scotland, so that side of my family are from Scotland, and I've always held that really dear to me. It's always meant a lot to me, that I have that relationship with Scotland almost. And again, that's something that I can definitely feel when I'm up there, and I think anyway, kind of funnels down into my landscape photography in a positive way for sure. So how does this relate to landscape photography in a broader sense? So interesting, I think. And for me, I think essentially, a really powerful photograph, there must be emotion somewhere. It's just my opinion. I think you can still take wonderful photographs, without any emotion. If you just go somewhere to a viewpoint and take a nice photograph, gorgeous conditions, of course you can. But for me, when I'm viewing photographs, it's almost like, it sounds a little bit silly to be honest, but it's like there's an emotion from the photographer that then gets conveyed into that photograph somehow, and then when I look at it as an audience member, let's say a viewer of the photograph, I can feel that emotion. It's like a journey of the emotion. I don't know, perhaps I'm talking bonkers, but I think there's something there for sure. And I think you can just recognize when a photograph has been taken with emotion, because it conjures up emotions within you when you're looking at the photograph for sure. It almost makes you feel like you want to be there, and you can feels similar emotions. I don't know, I think it's really, really interesting. And again, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and feelings on this for sure. So I wanted to talk quite briefly about a couple of photographs that I've captured in the past. And I think both these photographs convey emotion, but actually in two different ways. And I felt two different types of emotions. And again, this is something I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on. You know, I want us to discuss this. And the first one's this photograph that I got in the Scottish Highlands, where I said I pulled up and I was all emotional and crying. And this is of the three sisters. It's one of my favourite photographs for sure, but it's one of my favourite photographs because of the emotional connection that I had when I was taking it. So when I look at this photograph, you know, it's not just a conventionally attractive landscape, it's the emotion that, when I look at it, the emotion comes flooding back basically that I felt when I stood there. And I think it's interesting because it's all subjective. You know, you might be looking at that photograph now and you might not feel any emotion, but you might just think it looks like a nice landscape. But I think obviously that's a separate subject, and that's the beauty of landscape photography. But for me, there was 100% an emotional connection to that photograph, and all it takes is for me to look at that photograph again to conjure up the emotions. So that's one type of emotional connection to the landscape. And the second type's a much older photograph that I took in New Zealand. And it's this image of a mountain called Mount Sefton in Mount Cook National Park. And essentially I was just coming back from a hike down towards Mount Cook, and the light just suddenly changed. Some sort of low, almost storm clouds gathered, but there's still some side light. And I took this handheld, it was on my old Nikon D3100, and there was an emotional connection to the landscape, but it was a completely different emotion from the one that I felt in Scotland. And it was almost like it was awe-inspiring. The landscape was awe-inspiring, and that was the emotion that it gave to me. And then I felt then as a photographer, as a landscape photographer, it was my responsibility to try and capture that awesomeness and how inspired I felt when I was there. And I really think in this photograph I managed to do it, but I don't have an emotional connection to that landscape at all. You know, I loved my time in New Zealand, and it's one of the most beautiful countries in the world, but I never had an emotional connection to it like I do in Britain. But yeah, two different types of emotions there that I think are really, really interesting. And I think the New Zealand one is a little bit less complicated in a way. It's just, you know, it looks incredible. It feels incredible when I'm stood there, get the photograph, then the conditions change and it kind of goes back to normal, and then I don't feel that emotion anymore. Whereas when I was in the Three Sisters area in Scotland, it was like a consistent emotion of feeling like, oh God, this is absolutely incredible. Like, I love this place. So yeah, super interesting. Two different types of emotions in landscape photography. So that kind of brings me on to what's going to be my final point really, and that's kind of technical skill versus that intrinsic connection to the landscape. And again, this is a broad subject, talk for hours about this, but really interesting. So what I mean here is I think technical skill can be taught and it can be learned. You know, anyone can learn how to use a camera over time, but the emotional connection, it's not, I think you can teach somebody how to convey emotion in a photograph for sure. You know, if you've got if you're in the middle of a storm and you're trying to convey that, you know, you feel certain emotions when you're in a beautiful thunderstorm. You've got dark clouds rolling in, you might actually have some light from the side. It just creates this beautiful image in your mind, and we all know that you feel such a positive emotion. But I think that type of emotion is really different from that intrinsic connection and attachment to a land, if you know what I mean. And I don't think that's something that can be taught, but I think what I'm getting at is there needs to be, if you want to convey emotion in any sense of the word in a photograph, in a landscape photograph, there has to be emotion to begin with inside of you. You can't just make it up, you know. And I think especially with this intrinsic connection that you have to the landscape, it's not something that can be taught. You can't teach somebody to have an intrinsic connection to a landscape. But I think what I'm getting at is that I think it's really exciting. You know, I think if it's something you've ever experienced, you should acknowledge it and recognise it, and perhaps in many ways use it to your advantage as a landscape photographer. It's a really beautiful thing, I think. And if you can, I'm not there yet, but if you can find a way to, you know, feel those emotions and then connect it to your actual landscape photography. So connect the intrinsic emotion and connection to the technical skills, you're onto a winner. So I think that's something that I'll probably work on myself over the next few months when I get back to the UK. So I'd love to know what you guys think of this week's subject. Do you think it's just a load of nonsense, or is it something you guys have physically felt out on location as well? And remember, it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with landscape photography or photography in general. It could just be when you're out on hikes and stuff. But yeah, it's something that I've definitely felt. So I'm quite sad to be leaving Germany for sure, but I think on the other hand, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to be really grateful that it's given me this realisation of I need to be in the UK right now for my landscape photography as well. And yeah, I think I'll always look back on it positively in that aspect. And I think now I'm just looking forward to getting back to the UK and continuing on this journey of landscape photography for sure. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, as always, massively appreciated, and I guess I'll see you on Tuesday for the final adventure from Germany. I'll see you then. Out.